In the spirit of the Tholos Circle, where ancient thinkers gathered to debate the issues of today, this is Tholos Talks. Through deep insight and thought-provoking dialogue, we offer the tools to decode complexity and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome back to Tholos Talks. This is episode 9 of Coffee, Trade, and Tech, our series exploring how technology, trade, and global business intersect and what it means for companies in today's geopolitical and regulatory pressures. I'm very excited to welcome Alan Turley, a retired U.S. Commerce Foreign Service officer with over 30 years of experience working to establish and expand U.S. businesses in Asia, with a particular focus on Greater China and most recently, Japan. Alan spent 4 years as Minister Counselor for Commercial Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, retiring just recently in August 2025. He's also spent considerable time in the private sector, where he served as Vice President of International Affairs for FedEx Express in Asia Pacific for over a decade. Today, we're diving deep into the critical U.S. Japan relationship, the role of technology in that partnership, and where Alan sees this relationship heading as we look forward to 2026 and beyond. Alan, thank you for joining us.
Things are great, Jake. I am actually in Taipei right now in the middle of a long trip, both family and business, and it's been great. It's great to be back in Asia.
Well, Alan, I know that with the time difference, thank you for joining us this late. Any miscues we'll just attribute to the time shift.
Thank you.
You joined the Foreign Commercial Service Office in Beijing in 1986, right as China was opening economically. Walk us through what drew you to Foreign Service, what that early landscape felt like on the ground, and how your time across, Beijing, FedEx, DC, and now Tokyo shaped your thinking and commercial strategy, and how the U.S. engages Asia.
Actually, Jake, I started my career in the Foreign Service in Japan in 19...
Foreign Service?
I joined the Foreign Service. They hired me because I spoke Chinese and promptly sent me to 4 years in Tokyo. I got to China later, but my first experience in 86 was actually Bubble Japan, which was a fantastic experience with a great group of people. And Japan was the it country in the late 80s. The stock market was booming. Land in, the Imperial Palace was worth more than all of the state of California, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a fascinating time to be in Japan. It was a great eye-opener to the Foreign Service and the world of international trade.
Were you there during the crash as well?
No, I got out right before the crash. I mean, the stock market started to go down, but before it really went under, I actually left onto a next assignment. I always joke that I was the one who personally held up the Japanese bubble. And when I left, it all went to pieces, but I'm sure that wasn't it.
Which is why they sent you back at the end then.
Yeah, which is why they sent me back twice. Just to be clear, I started my career in Japan. I did 2 wonderful years in London learning tradecraft, and then went to China via Taiwan. So I was in Taiwan from January of 1993 to 96, and then in Beijing from 96 to 2000.
Well, I guess 2 questions. One is, did you just kind of stumble into this career, or was there always kind of a focus, in high school, college, grad school, I want to go be a diplomat?
I joke with people, it's actually fear of accountancy that drove me into the Foreign Service. So when I graduated from university, I was qualified to be an accountant, and instead I ran away from home and decided to study Chinese in Taipei. So I did that for 2 years, and then joined the Foreign Service because it made sense with my Chinese to join the Foreign Service. And as I said earlier, because I spoke Chinese, they sent me to Japan, which made a tremendous amount of sense. Really what it was, though, is I had been interested in doing something overseas for a while. When I graduated from university, did not really want to join the corporate world quite yet, and took a tour to go to Taiwan and study Chinese. I had studied Chinese at university, and that led naturally to the Foreign Service. But I was fortunate enough to get picked up by Commerce. And again, that first tour in Tokyo just was incredibly exciting. What an exciting time to be in Tokyo during the bubble. I ended up having the automotive portfolio. And as you can recall, in the late 80s, there was a lot going on with automotive talks between the U.S. and Japan. And I also did construction. And people don't remember, but there was a big push to get American construction companies involved in the Japanese construction market, which I was involved in. Absolutely fascinating.
So then you shifted from Tokyo to Beijing.
I took 2 years in London because you can't actually go to England if you ask for it. So because I spoke Chinese, they sent me to the UK for 2 years. I ran the trade center in London for 2 years. Then I'm the only person, I think, in Foreign Service history to curtail from London, to voluntarily say, I don't want to be in London anymore. I want to go to Taipei. I wanted to get back to Asia after 2 years in London. So I had 2 wonderful years on Grosvenor Square. I learned a lot about trade promotion, which is more technical and trade craft, but then went to Taipei for 3.5 years and then went to Beijing.
So you did see the whole accession to the WTO.
I was there for the second intellectual property agreement that was negotiated by then Deputy USTR Charlene Barshevsky.
Yep.
And then for the entire session of the WTO negotiations, we concluded our negotiations as the U.S. in 2000. So I was there for that. Again, great time to be in China, a lot going on. The WTO negotiations, absolutely fascinating. China made huge concessions in order to get into the WTO. I think now there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking on the decision to let China into the WTO. Was it a good thing? At the time, I think it made sense. It gave China an opportunity to grow and develop and to have the potential to become a true market economy. The fact that China didn't take that opportunity and made it turn inward is not the fault of the U.S. negotiators. That's on the Communist Party of China.
Let's kind of full circle. You there for the opening entry into WTO, this session.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward, Trump won 2017-ish. You're
Right.
Deputy Assistant Secretary of the China Desk at Commerce. You had a front row seat at the Trump administration's engagement with China, the phase 1 trade deal, the tariffs, the kind of the ups and downs. What was that like? What did you learn from Trump 1 versus what we're seeing, in this second administration of the Trump presidency?
What did I learn? Wow. The lack of understanding of where China really wanted to go with those negotiations and ineffectiveness, if you will, of the tools that we have to manage the China trade relationship would be the thing that strikes me the most. And going back a bit, from 2002 to 2016, I worked for Federal Express Corporation in Asia Pacific. I would say I spent about half of my time or more on China issues in China, helping FedEx to grow the business, helping FedEx to transition the business, and trying to expand our presence in the China market. And we definitely had a WTO issue in terms of access to the domestic market. And again, China, in my opinion, did not implement its full WTO commitments for the express delivery industry. It was intensely frustrating. And being at the end of the Obama administration, you could sense the frustration and sort of exhausted feeling that the Obama administration had. So I think the Trump people did try to change the terms of the relationship. The 301 case, for good or ill, was an attempt to deal with what China was doing. But I don't think that the tools that we had were adequate to the task at hand, the challenge that is China.
Interesting. And then shifting there to Japan, because Japan was, both directly and indirectly impacted from the U.S.-China relationship. The sense is, with this new trade agreement that the U.S. signed this summer, is there's a little bit more of the burden on Japan for its kind of frontline defense economically, politically. Were they getting a sense of that, or was that also a big shift for Japan?
Oh, I think they were in the first Trump administration. And, Prime Minister Abe at the time was fully on board with increasing Japan's defense spending, wanting Japan to be a more equal partner in the relationship. He had a very good personal relationship with President Trump, maybe because of some of the historical baggage that he carried. And, you may know his grandfather had been the economic master of Manchuria, the economic czar during the Japanese war effort, inappropriate comments, shall we say, about Chinese and Koreans. So there was a lot of burden on Abe and a lot of historical baggage there, but he was very much in favor. So things were moving already in a direction that the U.S. wanted. In terms of trade, of course, the Trump administration did strike during the first Trump administration a so-called phase one trade deal with Japan. That was very encouraging. They never got around, never had time to get to phase two. The relationship was moving in the right direction, I think, under Trump one.
So kind of just playing that out, positive relationship, and then under Biden seemed also be, very positive. Along comes Nippon Steel's offer to buy U.S. Steel. CFIUS gets involved and, politically, I think even the president got in front of CFIUS and said no.
Yep.
And then President Trump comes in, it's a still no, and then it's a yes.
Yeah, and I think that the lesson there for the Japanese was complicated, but I think there were a couple. One is that and this I think shocked the Japanese, that the anti-foreign, anti-Japanese sentiment that had been so prevalent in the 80s when I was there was still latent and still out there. There was an understanding among more sophisticated people about the sensitivities surrounding U.S. Steel, just the very name, United States Steel Corporation, and the sensitivity of the steel industry. The fact that President Biden, and I always pointed this out to people, was not really a Clinton New Wave Democrat. He was more of an old school Union Dick Gephardt Democrat. We've kind of forgotten about those Democrats.
If I recall, his dad was, involved in the union.
Yeah, I mean, we've forgotten. So there was a visceral reaction to this. The second thing, though, is also, let's face it, Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel, they botched this deal. They did not do their prep work to get the political establishment on side. They announced this very suddenly. I can tell you the story. The day the deal was announced, I got a call at 4 p.m. in Tokyo from one of my colleagues in the economic section of the embassy saying, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has just called us. Nippon Steel has a big announcement to make in the United States. They need to come in and talk to the embassy. And we were scrambling to get a meeting with the ambassador. He was out. They were making the meeting that night. The econ counselor couldn't do it. So I did it, commercial minister counselor. It was so late that we could not get the Nippon Steel executives into the building. To get someone into the embassy, you need security clearance. You need to call the RSO. I literally had to meet them in the lobby of the office building next door, where they kind of smiled at me and said, yeah, we're about to purchase U.S. Steel for, I can't remember what the number was, but, several $1 billion. And I remember thinking, have you guys done any prep work for this? I mean, this is going to be a big deal.
And during an election year.
So the sophisticated Japanese companies, the Toyotas, the Nissans, the people who had deep knowledge, and a lot of people in the United States knew that this, had not been well done. But it got into the press, and some ugly things were said about the Japanese. So it hurt, raised concerns about the alliance and whether the U.S. will continue to welcome Japanese investment. And Japan, as you know, is the largest source of foreign direct investment in the United States. They currently have over $800 billion invested. They employ close to 1 million Americans. So, this was a big deal, but it was complicated. It was a complicated deal. It wasn't black and white, and certainly the Japanese knew it wasn't black and white.
It also, I think, highlights the nuance and the importance of engaging with your principals, whether they're shareholders, employees, or even, government officials.
Yeah, and again, there were all kinds of we could talk about this deal for an hour. I mean, there was competing U.S. firm that was more than happy to spread anti-Japanese propaganda, that there was the unions that were trying to get the best deal for their members, which you would expect. There were politicians jumping on board, sort of not wanting to be outflanked on protecting American jobs and protecting American companies. It was a mess. And again, they had done almost no spade work ahead of time to sort of prepare people for this and get people on their side and explain their side of the story and get ahead of it ahead of time.
Now, I think your analogy is spot on with, growing a crop. You got to plow the field, fertilize, engage, water, constantly attention. Full circle then, it's been approved. We've got another, commitment of $550 billion from the Japanese to invest in the U.S. The semiconductor sector seems to be even, more integrated into the U.S. economy. How do you see that playing out, both from the technology perspective, the investment perspective, and then kind of moving forward with both, America first, but also with engaging with kind of the U.S.-China strategy and working with allies?
Well, as I said earlier, Jake, the Japanese are the largest source of foreign direct investment in the United States. They will continue to invest. Whether or not we get $550 billion.
That is committed, right?
If you really read the text of the agreement, it's committed, sort of.
Sort of, yeah. But my point is that it's not actually in the funnel.
It's not actually. Nobody in Japan has $550 billion worth of cash burning a hole in their pocket, ready to drop at a moment's notice into the United States. As I said, total Japanese investment, cumulative, $800 billion. So 550 in the next 3 years is going to be a big leap. That doesn't include, of course, that's FDI. That doesn't include portfolio investment. So there's all kinds of nuance there. But I think more importantly, the Japanese want to invest in the U.S. market. They will continue to invest in the U.S. market. Take semiconductors. Japanese semiconductor companies are no longer world leaders. Their share of the global semiconductor market way down, less than 10%. But Japanese semiconductor equipment manufacturers and materials manufacturers are absolutely critical to the semiconductor supply chain. The U.S. is a critical market for them. They want to diversify. They want to be in the U.S. market. They will continue to invest. You all know the problems that they're having in the U.S. It's expensive. Costs are going up. Approvals take a long time. Finding workers is a big problem for these companies. So CHIPS Act funding has been great. We don't know what incentives the Trump administration will provide for semiconductor manufacturing. Other countries are providing those incentives. So again, I think they want to invest, they'll continue to invest, but the amount will really depend on a lot of different market forces. And one of the surprises I have is that this administration, although they said they don't like the CHIPS Act funding, they haven't talked about what incentives they're going to offer foreigners to invest in the United States. They've offered a lot of sticks in terms of tariffs, but is that going to be sufficient? My personal feeling is it would be wise to combine some carrots with the tariff sticks.
If I recall, kind of the impetus for the original CHIPS Act did come from the Trump administration in the first term. Maybe there's been a question about how that was rolled out under the Biden administration, but you have seen the second administration pivoting, converting some of those grants to equity ownership.
Yep. And that'll be interesting to see, but there's no new money. And that 52 billion that was there is pretty much spent. So, one of the questions will be, is there going to be new funding? I think that clearly 52 billion was great, but there's certainly room for more in that industry where the sums are so enormous, this required sums.
You alluded earlier that, kind of hitting on Japan's economic situation. So given their demographic decline, some economic stagnation, I keep hearing reports that the Bank of Japan may have to continue to increase interest rates in order to maintain stability with the currency. How do you see Japan managing those economic issues that are also directly tied to their political issues?
With great difficulty. What's happening in Japan, and I think we can talk about the problems with where Japan is. The other piece of it, though, is where Japanese corporations are. And those are two slightly different, maybe sometimes very different things. Japanese companies have internationalized to a tremendous degree and are no longer as tied to the Japanese domestic market as they used to be. We were just talking about semiconductors. I just looked today, Tokyo Electron, the biggest supplier, only about 25% of their business is in Japan. Their sales are mainly overseas. Take a company in another industry, Mitsubishi Heavy, which used to be a very Japan-centric, traditional heavy manufacturer in Japan. I haven't seen the statistics, but easily 35, 40% of their business is now outside of Japan. So what I want to say there is corporate Japan will continue to want to invest overseas and has the wherewithal, the financial backing, the good balance sheets to continue to do that. Where Japan as a nation is, where the government is in a real fiscal problem. As you know, Japan is the most heavily indebted country in the OECD, at least, if not in the world. The government's debt is 260% of GDP and rising. Prime Minister Takaichi proposed a supplementary budget that is a sort of deficit busting measure because she feels that she needs to spend this money to revitalize Japanese industry. You alluded to the Bank of Japan having to raise interest rates. The fiscal situation in Japan, if not red alarms are ringing, certainly yellow alarms are ringing about where the government of Japan is and where fiscal spending is. And that's going to be a huge problem for Japan as a country. Again, corporate Japan has, in a sense, untethered itself from some of the problems in the domestic market.
How are you also seeing that the economic issues in Japan impact U.S. companies that are trying to sell into Japan? But before we jump, answer that, and I want you to talk about the role of the U.S. Commercial Service Office and embassies.
In terms of how U.S. companies selling into Japan, it depends on the industry, but overall, you alluded to it. Let's face it, Japan is a shrinking market. This is a country that is losing approximately 800,000 people a year in population and will continue to do so for the next 25, 30 years. I mean, that's shocking. That's a Washington, D.C. just taken off the map every year. The market is overall not growing. There are, however, as in any market, signs of growth in certain areas. So take AI and data centers, huge interest in the U.S. companies in investing in AI, investing in data centers in Japan, tremendous latent demand Semiconductors is another area with the Taiwanese building factories in the south, Micron and other U.S. companies continuing to invest in Japan. So a lot of interest in that. Medical is another one where there is seen to be tremendous growth, a lot of interest in the pharmaceutical industry in Japan. But if you're talking about what a, selling cars, for example, which the administration is talking about, it's a declining market for vehicles. If you look at the trends long term over the last 5 years, the market has declined. So who wants to make a large investment in service centers and dealerships in a market that's declining?
That's a really good point. It also reminds me, I think, going back to 2010, 2012, Japan led the world in, broadband to the home. I think they were one of the first, economies, the OECD, to have something like 85% fiber optics to the home. I remember some, APEC TEL meetings, and their question was, we've made this investment. How do we use it? How do we get, this is kind of before we saw, telemedicine, distance learning, all of those, e-services coming on board. Do you see a real opportunity both for a growth perspective, but also for U.S. investment in services on the IT and tech side?
Absolutely. And, we're seeing companies looking at that. I mean, you've mentioned a couple. You've got entertainment, you've got the e-delivery of all kinds of services. You've got food delivery. I mean, Uber was not doing real well in their taxi service, but Uber Eats, and they had a great female Japanese CEO for a while, was going gangbusters. So there's a lot of opportunities for services improvements in Japan, and a lot of U.S. companies investing in that. Just as an aside, I remember meeting with one Japanese company that had invested in hospitals overseas. And what they said was, we're investing in hospitals overseas. We really want to learn the medical services business.
Interesting.
Right now, Japan is not open for corporate ownership of hospitals. But when it is, we want to be ready to come back to Japan with our overseas experience and our overseas learnings and bust this market open, because healthcare is one area in Japan, the provision of healthcare services, where there are huge areas for improvement because of the way the market is currently structured. And it's one of the things that Japan is going to have to look at as they seek to keep healthcare costs down.
So let's use healthcare as a case study. You get a healthcare executive that shows up to the embassy, says, Alan, I want 10% market share in 5 years. How can you help me if you put your embassy hat, your commercial service officer hat back on?
The embassy offers a variety of services to somebody like that. So first thing we'd say is, look, how much market research have you done? What do you know about the market? And we can talk in general terms about how big the market is, provide sort of basic outlines. We can also point people to other people who have better information on the market. Hey, these are the people you need to talk to, the medical association, the research organizations. So that's a basic service. Second, when they get to the point where they say, okay, we're interested, we've done our research, we think this is a market entry strategy. We help companies find, as the embassy, agents, distributors, partners in Japan. We offer that for a fee. It's very reasonable. Help them identify qualified partners. And then finally, if they have a partner or if they have a plan, we provide, so say you've got that company and it wants to do a big launch. We might say, we can co-sponsor a launch for you. Service provided, there's a fee required, but we will help you launch that service in Japan. We'll have the embassy backing. We'll do it either outside. We may do it in the embassy. We will help you get the right people there from the government, from industry, to do let's say, a product launch or an explanation of your services. And, we can't work miracles. Everybody says, we want the Minister of Health to come to our event, and we always say, we're sorry, but, you're not going to get the Minister of Health, so let's aim a little lower. And that's not possible for us, but we can bring in people who know the Minister of Health, people who talk to the Minister of Health and talk about that. So those are some of the things that the embassy can do for companies that are interested in exploring the Japanese market. It's great service provided to companies that really are serious about getting into the market, because it is a market that demands a lot of resources and a lot of management attention if you're going to penetrate the market. And you can't do it without real commitment of time and resources.
Yeah. And just putting my previous hats back on, when Alan says for a fee, we're not talking tens of thousands of dollars.
Oh, no, we're talking very reasonable.
Like hundreds or maybe a few thousand, depending on the scope.
I just want to say, when I talk about a launch, you want to do that at a hotel, you've got to pay for the hotel. So we can help you organize it. People say, oh, you don't provide the coffee and tea. You're like, no, you got to pay for coffee and tea and whatever.
Pre-brought coffee, literally. No, and one thing that also surprised me in engaging with the embassy is, not just your contacts, but the deep understanding of the domestic rules and regulations.
Right.
That it was an incredible resource. And the other thing that surprised me was the power of a photo, of having the U.S. ambassador show up at a launch and doing just a few Photoshop, pics with different, folks in the market was invaluable. I know when we were working on a license in Indonesia, we launched it. I was shocked at how many people from the Ministry of Communication showed up because they wanted a photo with the ambassador.
No, that's true. But you have to remember, you worked for AT&T, which was a brand name U.S. company. Indonesia is a smaller market than Japan. I'm always cautious about promising people that the ambassador is going to show up at their commercial event. Rahm Emanuel was great. He showed up at a lot of different things, but he could not show up at every company's event. So we told people, look, we got to aim a little lower. And
that's a fair point, but it was interesting that there was a lot of interest from the local officials.
And it is, and it's great. And don't get me wrong, most ambassadors are really more than happy to support U.S. business. But when you get to a place like Japan, where the ambassador can't possibly go to every event he's invited to,
Yep.
Hard decisions have to be made. So, we would talk to people and they'd say, well, when we were in Algeria, the ambassador opened up his house. And I said, well, that's because in Algeria, the ambassador gets 5 companies a month. We're doing 5 or 6 a day. So it's just different.
So you did bring up Ambassador Rahm Emanuel. What was that like working for him in a pretty intense, time? And if I recall, he was very active on Twitter. What was that like? And is there a story you'd like to share with our listeners with working with him?
Rahm Emanuel, not an easy guy to work for, famously irascible, impatient, profane. But I have to say, he did a great job as ambassador. He was very active. He represented the United States ably. He was on point when we needed him to do something and it was important. He did it. He was an incredibly effective ambassador. Rahm's stories are legendary. I'm not sure I have anyone I can say on camera that doesn't involve an excess amount of profanity, which he is, of course, famous for. My favorite, though, is he's very impatient. And I think he wanted to send a message sometimes to the Japanese. So the first meeting we had with Keidanren, which is, of course, the Japanese Federation of Industries, if you will, a business roundtable plus of Japan, we had the Americas Committee, and these are very senior Japanese CEOs and vice presidents. Really some of the most senior people from some of the largest companies in Japan. And we were having a good conversation in English at the beginning of the meeting. what was going on with the U.S. Japan relationship, and it was all good, and he was enjoying it. And then the Japanese Keidanren decided, okay, now we're going to start the formal meeting. And they went into Japanese mode, and they all had a prepared speech in Japanese to read to Rahm Emanuel with consecutive interpretation. Well, that lasted less than 10 minutes, at which point Rahm said, guys, this isn't working. Got up and left the meeting.
You're there, right? So did you make the calculus? Do I go out with my boss or do I stay here and clean up?
No, we stayed and said, guys, look, we're sorry, but this wasn't, and, we all learned what he was going to work for. And on one hand, you can say, wow, that was really incredibly rude, and on the other hand, it was like, I'm not going to put up with this BS anymore. I'm not going to listen to your canned speeches. Talk to me like a human being. You speak English. I'm not going to sit here and listen to, a half hour of prepared canned speeches. And I think it was a good message for me to get in terms of what the ambassador was in. It was a great message for Keidanren, how they needed to talk to the U.S. ambassador like a real person, not like, he wasn't going to listen to their canned stuff.
Yeah. From the outside looking in, the sense we got was, he was there to solve problems.
He was there to solve problems. If you think about what an ambassador does, it's all about being a conduit at the very highest level between the leadership of the United States and the leadership of Japan. Being able to say, look, guys, this is what the president of the United States thinks. Here's why he thinks it. Let me explain this to you. And then also being able to go back to the White House and say, look, this is what Japan is saying. This is why they're saying it. That's the job. That is the critical job of an ambassador. All the rest is kind of be it, shaking hands with school kids, having a 4th of July party. It's really about being that bridge. And in that sense, Rahm Emanuel was almost the perfect person to do that because he had operated at the highest levels of the U.S. government. He was trusted by the White House, and he could convey those messages to Japan and similarly could convey what Japan was saying back to the United States. That's what an ambassador should be focused on, and that's what he was focused on.
Yeah, and that's a good point. The ambassador is the representative of the president.
Right.
Period.
And if he can't speak in a place like Japan on behalf of the president, then he doesn't belong there.
So when your phone would ring, and I'm sure you knew it was Rahm calling, did you ever have that moment of, do I answer or not?
Often.
But I'm sure, if Rahm happens to be listening, you always answered. If you could.
No, he would know. I mean, but no, I answered, and again, let's just say that he didn't respect boundaries on work. Let's just put it that way.
That the inverse of the Jimmy Buffett, it's 5 p.m. somewhere.
Yeah, the inverse of the Jimmy Buffett, it's 5 p.m. somewhere. It's a work day somewhere. And I can remember getting calls on Sunday and weekends and at night. I have to say, that's the deal you make when you go to an embassy and you're working for someone, like Rahm Emanuel, is that's going to happen. And that's part of the fun of the job. It's part of the frustration of the job. But on the whole, it's a trade I was willing to make.
So if I look back on my own personal, 2 tours at the government, it's always fun in retrospect.
Yeah, there were times when it was not fun. I mean, when he calls you on a Sunday morning and says, I need an appointment tomorrow, you're like, it's Sunday. I don't have the chairman of Toyota on speed dial.
I'll see what I can do, sir.
I'll see what I can do, sir. No, but again, that was part of the deal. It wasn't always fun, but, it was meaningful.
So kind of taking a step back, you've seen both sides kind of play out in terms of, relationship with U.S. Japan. We seem to be back on a very stable footing now that we've got the latest trade agreement executed. Where do you see the common ground between the U.S. and Japan? I think it's hard to separate economically and politically?
The common grounds, if you think about it, is security, because we both defined security not only as what we traditionally think of territorial security and military security, but also economic security. And Japan has been focused on economic security for much longer than the United States. They're a lot more exposed as an island economy versus a continental economy such as the United States. But really, all the dimensions of security are critically important to the alliance. And where Japan's thinking is that we and they need to work together on all aspects of security because of the threat from China. And let's be clear, Japanese sometimes want to walk on more eggshells than we do around this because they're a lot closer to China. They're a lot more dependent on China for trade than we are. But the fact of the matter is again, that they are very concerned about both their economic and their, if you will, traditional military security. And the big threat there is China. Of course, there are smaller threats from Russia and North Korea, but China is the overwhelming strategic issue that solidifies the U.S. Japan alliance.
So kind of looking forward, we talked about, technology, some other sectors, healthcare. What are the kind of the opportunity you see going forward? And what advice do you have on businesses as they're thinking about the relationship and the future of opportunities in Japan?
I think the opportunities are tremendous in terms of what the U.S. and Japan can cooperate on in security. So my office, for example, when I was there, very focused on helping to introduce U.S. cybersecurity companies and U.S. cybersecurity solutions to Japanese industry and the Japanese government. And there was a whole of embassy effort to increase and strengthen Japan's cybersecurity across the board. And again, we could talk a lot about what Japan needs in cybersecurity, but that's an area where we desperately need to work together and cooperate to strengthen our infrastructure. And, again, across the board, from the government down to hospital clinics and patient data and healthcare, to the transportation systems, the power systems, et cetera, et cetera. A great example of where we can and need to cooperate. Supply chains. Of course, critical minerals is one. I think Japan is far ahead of the United States on their thinking about critical minerals, their tools that they have available in the government to create supply chain, strengthen supply chains, to work with their companies. There's a lot we could learn from them on that. And it's not just, of course, critical minerals. You get into food security. You get into critical industrial supplies. How much machinery are you getting? And all of this is about diversification and strengthening. It's not necessarily saying we're not going to buy from China anymore, but Japan in particular is very concerned about industries where they are just overly reliant on Chinese sources of supply. I think the opportunities for cooperation are great. I think, quite frankly, again, we in the U.S. government really haven't quite organized ourselves yet as to how we're going to manage this and how we're going to protect ourselves. BIS, my former colleagues at the Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Industry and Security, simply are not staffed big enough. They don't have the budget to do this. State wants to have a piece of it, but I'm not sure if they really understand industry well enough. ITA, the International Trade Administration, which I was a part of, is trying to reorient itself. But you need new legislation. You need new thinking in the government. And it's going to be a while before we sort that out. And so I worry more about the U.S. side than the Japan
Interesting.
side.
Interesting. So I'll leave you with one final question, Alan. Favorite Japanese anime? And part two of that, have you made it through all the episodes of One Piece?
I have not made it through all of the episodes of One Piece. I've seen some, mainly with my children when they were small, but no,
Of course.
not all the episodes of One Piece. My favorite Japanese anime is still Kimetsu no Yaiba, which I think is translated into Demon Hunters. It's a new one. And I find the graphics beautiful. The story, it's set in sort of Taisho era, 1920s, 1910s Japan. It's quite well done. And that would have to be my favorite, but it's a new one. If you had to go back, of course, Cowboy Bebop is a touchstone.
Yeah.
Cowboy Bebop.
Netflix tried to make a live action of it.
No, please don't.
Leave the classics.
Leave the classics. So that was, I'm sorry, no. I watched one episode and couldn't bear to watch it more. I know the people involved were well-intentioned, so I don't mean to denigrate their efforts, but no, that was terrible.
Well, Alan, thank you for joining us. Sorry we didn't have a chance to get into Tokyo Vice either. I would say a must watch if you have any interest in the Japanese culture.
Tokyo Vice is great. I don't know how much representative of current Japanese culture.
Current, yes.
The Tokyo Vice is. It's kind of, no, it was early 2000s or 90s. I can't remember when Jake was active.
The other Jake, be clear.
The other Jake. I'm sorry, the other Jake. Yes, the other Jake. He's an amazing person. It's a fantastic story. There's not actually that many people who die from getting stabbed with swords inside. So please remember, your listeners, it's actually a very safe place to be.
It is very safe, indeed. Yeah, I had a friend, I think when his son was about 6 years old, was just, here's your metro ticket, go to school.
It's famous. Japan is famous for that. The kids are expected to go to school by themselves on the subway from first grade on. You see 7 and 8-year-old kids on the subway all the time, and they take the subway themselves. In many ways, a remarkable society. Well, Jake, thanks a lot. I do appreciate the conversation, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Absolutely, Alan. Thanks for joining us. And your experience offers exactly the kind of grounded perspective we need as companies, advisors kind of navigate the U.S. Japan strategy. For our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Stay with us for future conversations on the people, policies, and partnerships shaping the global economy. That's all for today's episode of Tholos Talks. I'm Jake Jennings. To learn more about Basilinna's work at the intersection of trade, technology, and global business, visit basilinna.com/insights or email me at jake.jennings@basilinna.com. We'll be back with more conversations that go beyond the headlines. Thank you, everyone. Alan, take care.
Take care, Jake.
Thank you for listening to Tholos Talks, a series by the Basilinna Institute. Available on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Make sure to follow and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date on upcoming episodes. To learn more about these topics or the work we're doing, visit the Basilinna website.